The cockpit was sealed, the engine was screaming, and the enemy was dead ahead. Yet the real killer was already inside the plane. Long before American pilots ever saw a German fighter flash past their canopy, before machine guns rattled, or contrails crossed the sky, something far more merciless had already claimed its territory. It waited above the clouds, silent and invisible, a force no pilot could dogfight and no bullet could stop. As the United States rushed into the air war over Europe, speed and altitude became obsession. Reports from early encounters made one thing brutally clear: German fighters climbed faster, performed better at height, and seemed almost untouchable once they reached the thin, frigid air far above the battlefield. To American planners, the solution appeared obvious. If the enemy owned the high ground, then America would simply climb higher. What few truly grasped was that altitude did not just belong to German aircraft. It belonged to the cold. Young pilots arriving in England were filled with confidence and fear in equal measure. Most were barely in their 20s. Some had never even seen snow before training. Yet now they were being told they would fly at heights where the air itself could kill them. Briefings spoke of tactics, formations, and enemy capabilities, but rarely lingered on the physical reality of the sky they were entering. Aircraft were marvels of engineering, bristling with guns and powered by engines that could roar like beasts. Yet the cockpits were little more than thin metal shells. Insulation was minimal. Heating systems were inconsistent. Oxygen equipment was still evolving. On the ground, engineers trusted numbers and blueprints. In the air, pilots trusted their bodies to endure what machines demanded. As aircraft climbed higher, the world outside transformed. The familiar blue sky darkened into something harsher and more alien. Sunlight became blindingly bright, reflecting off endless white cloud tops, while shadows inside the cockpit deepened into cold gloom. At 20,000 feet, breath already felt thinner. At 25,000 feet, exposed skin began to ache. At 30,000 feet, the temperature plunged to levels no human body was designed to withstand for long. Sweat froze inside gloves. Moisture crystallized on goggles. Even blinking could become painful. Yet pilots kept climbing, driven by orders and the belief that height meant survival. Many American planes were not pressurized in those early years. The idea of sealing a cockpit and controlling internal pressure was still new, complex, and expensive. Instead, pilots relied on heated flight suits, thick gloves, and boots lined with fur or electrically warmed elements that often failed without warning. Oxygen masks delivered life-saving air, but valves froze, hoses cracked, and regulators malfunctioned under extreme cold. A slight failure was all it took. Hypoxia crept in quietly, dulling thoughts, slowing reactions, and making pilots feel strangely calm even as danger increased. Some mistook the sensation for confidence. Others never realized what was happening at all. Mission after mission revealed unsettling patterns. Aircraft returned riddled with bullet holes, yet their pilots complained less about enemy fire and more about numb hands and feet. Some couldn't feel the trigger. Others struggled to read instruments through frost-coated glass. There were stories of men landing with blackened fingers, frost-bitten cheeks, and eyes burning from frozen tears. Commanders initially viewed these as unfortunate side effects, problems that toughness and discipline could overcome. After all, German pilots flew in the same skies. Surely American airmen could endure it too. But endurance has limits, and the sky was merciless in testing them. The cold did not care about courage or patriotism. It did not announce its attack. It seeped in slowly, stealing heat, clarity, and time. Inside the cockpit, metal frames sucked warmth from bodies. Control stiffened. Radios crackled and failed. The longer a mission lasted, the more the aircraft seemed to betray the man flying it. Even simple tasks required effort as muscles slowed and joints locked. Fatigue arrived faster than expected. magnified by the strain of fighting both gravity and temperature. Training back home had not prepared pilots for this reality. Simulated altitude chambers could demonstrate oxygen deprivation, but they could not fully replicate hours of exposure to sub-zero cold while flying under combat stress. Manuals warned about frostbite and hypoxia, yet reading about danger was not the same as feeling it claw at your bones. Many pilots underestimated the threat, believing skill and willpower would carry them through. Others trusted the equipment without question, unaware how fragile it truly was at extreme altitude. As the push for higher performance continued, engineers modified aircraft to squeeze out every ounce of capability. Engines were tuned for thin air. Superchargers were improved. Wings were adjusted, but the human element lagged behind. Cockpit heaters that worked perfectly on test flights failed in combat conditions. Electrical systems struggled under strain. A single damaged wire could cut heat entirely, turning the cockpit into a freezer within minutes. Pilots learned to recognize the signs: a creeping numbness, clumsy fingers, a foggy mind. By the time those signs appeared, it was often already too late. The irony was cruel. Altitude did offer tactical advantages. From higher ground, American pilots could spot German fighters first, dive with speed and disengage if necessary. But reaching that height came at a cost paid in bloodless casualties that never appeared on enemy kill counts. Planes were lost without ever being shot at. Crews vanished over friendly territory. Their aircraft found later intact, engines silent, the men inside frozen in their seats. Investigations puzzled over these losses, initially suspecting mechanical failure or navigation error. The truth emerged slowly and uncomfortably. Veteran pilots began to warn newcomers. They spoke in quiet tones about missions where the cold felt worse than enemy fire. They described moments when thought slowed, when time felt stretched, when checking instruments became strangely difficult. Some admitted they had nearly blacked out without realizing why. These stories circulated in mess halls and briefing rooms, unofficial. Lessons passed between men who had survived by luck as much as skill. Official doctrine, however, was slower to change. War demanded results, and altitude promised them. Commanders faced impossible choices: fly lower and risk German fighters dominating the engagement, or fly higher and risk losing pilots to an enemy that could not be fought. Losses mounted either way. In the relentless pressure to gain air superiority, the human body became just another variable, one that could be pushed until it failed. Replacement pilots arrived continuously, eager and untested, unaware that the sky itself was already measuring them. Every mission began the same way. Engines roared to life. Aircraft lifted from runways slick with rain or frost. Formation tightened as planes climbed steadily, the ground shrinking beneath them. Inside the cockpit, heaters hummed or didn't. Oxygen flowed or faltered. Pilots adjusted masks, flexed fingers, stamped feet, and focused on checklists. The enemy lay ahead, but first came the ascent, minute by minute, foot by foot, into colder, thinner air. Some pilots described the climb as the most dangerous part of the mission. There was nothing to see, nothing to shoot, only the steady draining of warmth and awareness. They watched frost creep along metal frames like living things. They listened to the engine's pitch and felt vibrations through numb hands. They waited for the moment level off would come, knowing that once there was no quick escape from the cold without abandoning altitude and advantage. The belief that altitude equaled safety began to crack under the weight of experience. Safety from enemy guns did not mean safety from the sky. Yet momentum carried the strategy forward. America had committed to winning the air war through technology and production, and altitude was part of that equation. Each frozen cockpit became an unspoken cost of progress, a price paid quietly so that others might learn. By the end of those early campaigns, one lesson was becoming unavoidable. The Germans had not just mastered aircraft design, they had adapted their pilots and equipment to the environment they fought in. America, rushing to catch up, had underestimated how unforgiving that environment truly was. The sky over Europe was not merely a battlefield. It was a hostile world, one that demanded respect before it offered victory. What finally shattered any illusion that the cold was merely an inconvenience were the missions that came back wrong in ways no one could ignore. Aircraft returned without their leaders. Formations broke apart for no tactical reason. Bombers drifted miles off course despite clear weather. Fighter escorts failed to respond to radio calls, flying straight and level as if guided by ghosts. At first, commanders blamed navigation errors, radio interference, or inexperienced pilots. But as reports accumulated, a darker pattern emerged. These were not combat losses. These were men disappearing inside perfectly functioning machines. Pilots who survived began describing the same terrifying progression. It always started subtly, a tingling in the fingers that made switches harder to flip, a strange calm that replaced tension as if fear itself had frozen away. Thoughts slowed, decisions felt distant and important. Some pilots laughed into their oxygen masks for no reason, convinced everything was fine. Others fixated on trivial details, staring at a single gauge while missing everything else. By the time alarm bells rang in their minds, their bodies were already betraying them. Hypoxia was the silent assassin. Oxygen systems were designed for altitude, but they were fragile, sensitive to cold, vibration, and damage. A slight crack in a hose, a frozen valve, or an improperly fitted mask could reduce oxygen flow just enough to starve the brain. Unlike pain or fear, hypoxia did not announce itself clearly. It whispered. It convinced pilots they were thinking clearly when they were not. It made them confident when they should have been terrified. The cold made everything worse. Extreme temperatures thickened lubricants, stiffened moving parts, and weakened. Materials never meant to endure such punishment for hours at a time. Heating systems that worked on the ground failed once aircraft reached cruising altitude. Electrical wiring became brittle. Moisture froze inside connectors. A heater cutting out was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Without heat, body temperature dropped rapidly, especially in a cockpit exposed to constant airflow. Shivering gave way to numbness. Numbness gave way to lethargy. There were missions where pilots landed alive but barely conscious, pulled from their cockpits with hands frozen into claws around the controls. Medics treated frostbite that blackened fingers and toes, sometimes requiring amputations. Faces blistered and cracked. Eyes suffered damage from freezing air leaking around goggles. These men survived, but many never flew again. Others returned to duty after recovery, carrying a new fear that no briefing could erase. More disturbing were the aircraft that never returned at all. Search crews found planes intact in fields or forests, fuel exhausted, engines undamaged. Inside, pilots sat motionless, expressions calm as if asleep. No bullet holes, no signs of struggle, just silence and ice. These discoveries forced investigators to confront the truth that America was losing pilots to an enemy that left no wreckage, no dogfights, no glory. Official reports began to change tone. Where earlier documents spoke of exposure issues, new language acknowledged critical physiological failures. Engineers were summoned. Medical officers were consulted. The air war was no longer just a contest of machines and tactics. It was a biological experiment being conducted at 30,000 feet. How long could a human survive in such conditions? How much cold could be endured before judgment failed? How reliable were systems meant to preserve life when pushed beyond their limits? Training programs adjusted slowly, often too slowly. Pilots were warned more explicitly about hypoxia, taught to recognize symptoms, drilled on emergency descent procedures. But recognition required awareness, and awareness was the very thing hypoxia stole first. A pilot who realized he was in trouble often discovered he no longer had the strength or clarity to fix it. Combat pressure compounded the danger. Once engaged with enemy fighters, there was no time to troubleshoot heaters or oxygen lines. Dogfights demanded split-second reactions, fine motor control, and razor-sharp focus. Cold-stiffened hands struggled to aim guns. Oxygen-starved brains lagged just enough to miss a critical moment. Some pilots survived combat only to lose consciousness afterward, slumping forward as their aircraft flew on without them. Spread through squadrons of pilots who survived by seconds. One fighter escort descended rapidly after feeling odd, barely regaining clarity before blacking out completely. Another noticed his wingman flying straight, despite enemy aircraft nearby, realized something was wrong, and physically rammed the other plane's wing to get his attention, saving both their lives. These acts of desperation highlighted how thin the margin had become. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots began to fear the climb more than combat. The enemy could be anticipated, studied, countered. The cold could not. It was always there, waiting, patient, indifferent. Men lay awake at night, replaying moments when their thoughts slowed or their vision blurred, wondering how close they had come to never waking at all. Confidence eroded, superstition crept in. Some pilots wore extra layers despite orders, sacrificing mobility for warmth. Others fiddled obsessively with oxygen connections, checking and rechecking until their fingers ached. Commanders faced mounting evidence that altitude alone was not the answer. But doctrine had momentum, and changing it risked conceding advantage to the enemy. German fighters still performed well at height. Bombers needed altitude for protection. The solution, everyone agreed, had to be technological. The human body could not be pushed further. The machines had to change. Engineers raced to redesign systems under wartime pressure. Heated suits were improved, though they remained prone to failure. Oxygen regulators were modified to resist freezing. Masks were redesigned for better seals. Cockpit insulation increased incrementally, constrained by weight and space. Pressurization, once considered impractical, began to look essential. Every improvement came with trade-offs, and every trade-off had to be tested in combat. Meanwhile, missions continued. Pilots flew knowing that even if they avoided enemy fire, survival was not guaranteed. The sky had become a second battlefield layered over the first, invisible but lethal. Each successful return felt less like routine and more like escape. The men who endured these conditions did so, not because they were immune, but because luck, vigilance, and imperfect equipment aligned just long enough. By the time the scale of the problem was fully understood, the damage had already been done. Experienced pilots were gone, lost not to German aces, but to frozen valves and thinning air. Their absence was felt sharply, for experience could not be mass-produced. New pilots arrived with better warnings and slightly improved gear, but the fear remained. The realization settled in quietly and uncomfortably. America had entered a realm where technological ambition had outrun human survival. The skies over Europe demanded more than bravery and numbers. They demanded respect for limits that had been ignored, and until those limits were addressed, every climb into the cold carried the same question, unspoken but ever-present: would the pilot return, or would the sky claim another victim without firing a single shot? The shift did not come suddenly, nor did it arrive wrapped in victory. It crept in through reports stained with loss, through medical charts that told the same story again and again, through the uneasy silence that followed missions where too many seats came back empty. Eventually, denial became impossible. The problem was no longer individual weakness or bad luck. It was structural, systemic, and deadly. The air war could not be won if pilots were being defeated by the sky itself. So America began to adapt, not out of inspiration but out of necessity paid for in frozen lives. Engineers were given new priorities. Speed and firepower still mattered, but survival climbed to the top of every discussion. Heating systems were redesigned with redundancy, so a single failure would not doom a pilot. Wiring was better insulated. Cockpit seals were tightened to reduce airflow that sucked warmth away. Oxygen systems were rebuilt with cold-resistant components, and testing standards became harsher, more realistic, less forgiving. Pressurization, once considered an extravagant complication, moved from experimental to essential. Aircraft like the B-29 emerged not just as weapons, but as environment, carefully engineered to keep humans alive dive where they were never meant to exist. Flight suits evolved rapidly. Layers became smarter, lighter, and more reliable. Electrically heated clothing was improved, with multiple circuits to prevent total failure. Gloves allowed better dexterity. Boots kept blood flowing longer. Masks fit tighter, fogged less, and delivered oxygen more consistently. None of it was perfect, but perfection was no longer the goal. Survival was. Training changed as well. Pilots were no longer merely warned about hypoxia and cold. They were drilled relentlessly on recognizing its earliest signs. They learned that confidence could be a symptom of danger, that calm could mean oxygen starvation, that hesitation might be the last warning they would get. Emergency descent procedures were practiced until they became reflex. Crew members were taught to watch each other constantly, to recognize subtle deviations in flying that signaled trouble inside the cockpit. The air war became a collective effort, not just to fight the enemy, but to keep each other conscious. These changes did not eliminate losses, but they slowed them. Missions that once ended in quiet disappearances now more often ended in emergency landing. Pilots descended when they felt off, no longer ashamed to sacrifice altitude for survival. Commanders gradually accepted that a living pilot flying tomorrow was worth more than a theoretical advantage today. It was a hard lesson for a military culture built on aggression and momentum, but it took root. As the technology improved, so did confidence. American aircraft began to meet German fighters on more equal terms. Pilots could stay high longer without fear that their own equipment would betray them. Dogfights became contests of skill again, not endurance against the cold. The invisible enemy did not vanish, but it lost its dominance. The sky was still hostile, but no longer entirely unforgiving. Victory in the air followed, slowly and unevenly. German pilots faced overwhelming numbers, improving American tactics, and machines that no longer sacrificed their crews to the environment. The balance tipped. Air superiority was not won by altitude alone, but by understanding what altitude demanded. The lesson had been brutal, but it endured. When the war ended, the frozen cockpits faded from headlines, replaced by celebrations and parades. Yet among those who had flown, memories lingered differently. Veterans spoke less about enemy aces and more about the cold that crept into their bones, about moments when their thoughts slipped away, about the fear of realizing something was wrong and wondering if they had time to fix it. Some remembered watching frost spread across instruments, while praying their heaters would hold. Others remembered the relief of descending, feeling warmth return as consciousness sharpened again. Aviation did not forget these lessons. In the decades that followed, every pressurized airliner, every high-altitude reconnaissance plane, every spacebound capsule carried the imprint of those early failures. The understanding that humans are fragile at altitude became foundational. Life support systems were designed with redundancy, alarms, and safeguards built on the knowledge written in wartime losses. The sky remained dangerous, but it was no longer underestimated. The story ended not with triumph, but with humility. America did beat German fighters. It did dominate the skies, but it learned, at terrible cost, that technology without respect for human limits is a weapon turned inward. The pilots who froze were not careless or weak. They were pioneers pushed too far, too fast, into an environment that punished ignorance without mercy. In the end, the war in the air was not just a battle between nations or machines. It was a confrontation with nature itself, fought in silence above the clouds. And the final victory belonged not to speed or altitude alone, but to the understanding that survival must come first, because even the most powerful aircraft is nothing more than a coffin if the man inside cannot breathe, think, or feel the warmth of life returning as he descends back toward Earth. The men who returned carried those lessons into every future flight, even when the war no longer demanded it. Long after engines shut down and uniforms were folded away, the memory of cold stayed with them. It was not just physical cold, but the memory of isolation, of being suspended between Earth and space with nothing but fragile systems standing between life and nothingness. Some veterans said they could still feel it decades later, a phantom chill when flying as passengers in warm, pressurized cabins. Knowing how different it once was, they remembered a time when a cracked hose or a silent heater could quietly decide their fate. Those who designed the next generation of aircraft listened closely. Engineers sat with pilots not just to hear about victories, but to hear about fear. They learned how numb fingers missed switches, how fogged goggles stole precious seconds, how oxygen starvation made danger feel distant and unreal. These stories shaped everything that followed. Redundancy became law. Warning systems became louder, clearer, impossible to ignore. Human survival was no longer an afterthought to performance. It was the foundation of it. In quiet moments, pilots reflected on how close they had come to being names on forgotten lists. Many realized they had survived not because they were better, but because the cold had spared them by chance. That understanding reshaped how they viewed courage. Bravery was no longer defined by how long one stayed at altitude, or how aggressively one pushed a mission. True courage became knowing when to descend, when to break off, when to live to fight again. That mindset spread, slowly changing the culture of air combat. The frozen losses also changed how victory itself was measured. Commanders began counting survival as success, not just enemy aircraft destroyed. A mission that returned intact crews mattered. A pilot who lived to fly again mattered. This shift did not weaken the war effort, it strengthened it. Experience accumulated instead of vanishing. Skill compounded instead of being reset. The sky, once a thief of lives, became a domain that could finally be mastered. As time passed, the enemy changed, but the lessons did not. Jet aircraft pushed even higher and faster, entering realms where the margin for error shrank further. Space flight followed, carrying humans beyond the atmosphere entirely. Every sealed cabin, every pressure suit, every life support alarm carried the DNA of those early failures over Europe. The men who froze unknowingly became guardians of future explorers, their losses transformed into safeguards that saved countless lives. History often celebrates the machines, the victories, the dramatic battles won in seconds of gunfire. It rarely pauses on the silent hours spent battling the environment itself, yet those hours shaped everything that followed. The air war proved that nature does not care who is right or wrong, who is brave or afraid. It responds only to preparation and respect. Ignore its rules, and it kills without anger or hesitation. In the end, America did not just conquer altitude. It learned how to coexist with it. The sky did not become friendly, but it became predictable. And predictability meant survival. The pilots who once climbed into freezing metal shells helped transform flight into something sustainable, something that no longer demanded sacrifice simply to exist above the clouds. The story closes not with a single moment, but with a realization carried forward. Through generations, progress is never just about going higher or faster. It is about understanding the cost of doing so and deciding that human life is worth protecting even in the pursuit of dominance. The frozen cockpits of the past stand as quiet warnings, reminding us that the greatest enemy is often the one we fail to see, and the greatest victory is learning before it is too late.